again, apologies for repetitiveness if you've sat in with session 1 or session 2 with us. But my name is Jim Petrowitz. I'm the Director of Business Development for Oros Knowledge Systems. This session is Beginner Track Session 3. The subject matter is all around the SEED project. Our speaker today is Josh Cullis again, who is the Technical Services Manager and Knowledge Aware Consultant at Oros Knowledge Systems. Again, during Josh's presentation, please keep the chat open. Feel free to write in any comments or questions you have. Again, if you're in the last session, there's no dumb questions. Please feel free to put in anything you want. We're happy to answer any questions. And there really is nothing that, is too fundamental or too basic for us. So we hear it all the time and we're anxious to hear it from you. There will be time at the end for Q&A. So we'll leave time for that. So answer your questions if you have any. And I do appreciate you all attending. But I without further ado, I want to get it right over to Josh so we can get going. So Josh, take it away.
Thanks, Jim. Like Jim said, we're going to talk a little bit about the SEED project. So if you were in the previous sessions, I mentioned the SEED project a little bit. This is generally what we call the onboarding of a new workflow or the implementing of a knowledge-aware technique in a different area. So we've kind of named it the SEED project. We have the idea behind Oros is for it to be an organic, bottom-up growth system. So the SEED project, there's a little bit of a play on words and maybe a marketing tactic for this. You plant the seed and it starts to grow and expand. And as we walk through this, you'll kind of see some of those metaphors made. But let's talk a little bit about the learning points. So we're going to go through an implementation roadmap. So we'll talk a little bit about typically what we see at different organizations, how the knowledge-aware technique is adopted, how it starts to expand, and what the different steps within that process are. We'll talk about some of the common challenges within those different steps in the process or in the roadmap. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the best practices that we have to address some of those common challenges within the actual roadmap or the implementation process when approaching something like a knowledge-aware implementation. So if we start off with just the high level, what does this implementation roadmap look like? The first thing that we're going to talk about is something that we call a briefing. So it's really an educational session, and we'll get into the details of what it is, but we want to go out and start to educate people on what this knowledge-aware concept is. We start to gain some buy-in. Then we want to go into what we call a SEED scoping session. So we want to frame out a project, understand where the value is going to be in that. Once we do that, we typically will then execute the SEED project. That SEED project then, upon completion, will get transitioned into production. And then generally what we'll see coming out of those first 4 steps is we've identified a couple different areas, and this may happen during a briefing, it may happen during a scoping session. It could really happen throughout that entire 4-step process that we've walked through to this point. But we start to identify other areas within the organization where this knowledge-aware technique could be valuable. So as we get completed with our initial SEED project, we'll then start to kick off additional ones. We'll do this adjacent development. And as we start to do more and more SEED projects, and this is kind of where we get that organic growth, and we've got the idea of planting a seed and it kind of taking over the organization, people start to hear about the value. They're going to then start to want to do this. We don't have to go out and sell it anymore. Excuse me. And people are just coming to Oros or coming to the other individuals within the organization that are implementing this knowledge-aware approach. That growth starts to become demanded. It's driven by incoming or inbound requests. And eventually, as the organization starts to onboard multiple workflows and additional different work practices, we get to this end state that really isn't a step in the process, but we depict it here as this enterprise capability. So the knowledge-aware technique and managing knowledge in an active way just becomes the way of doing business. So it's really a capability at the enterprise level. And that's really what we're shooting for as we start to do these different implementations. So if we start off with the Oros briefing, this is kind of the first step in the process. Our business development group does a really good job of putting together information and putting together content that allows us to educate end users or to educate stakeholders within the organization. So the purpose of the briefing is to educate. What we want to do is go out, communicate what the knowledge-aware technique is. We want to go through the different value propositions, maybe identify different ways that it can help provide efficiency, We have a lot of different use cases, a lot of different ways that organizations implement this type of technique. And this briefing is designed to do just that, right? We want to educate people with the end concept or the end objective or deliverable in mind being a buy-in on the concept. So some groups we come in, it clicks and it makes a lot of sense right off the bat. There's a lot of different places within the organization that people can see this technique being valuable. In other organizations, sometimes we'll do 2, 3, 4, 5 briefings because the orientation to the concept or maybe some of the things happening within the organization at the time might not have synergy between what we're doing. So these briefings can happen quickly. We can have just one of them. We have other organizations where we'll see the briefing done multiple times with multiple stakeholders. But the deliverable at the end of the briefing, essentially, or at the end of multiple briefings, is to get buy-in on the concept and the idea that managing knowledge in an active way and implementing a knowledge-aware technique is going to be valuable and the concept makes sense. So that's the first step in our process of getting started. The second one, like we talked about at the beginning, is scoping a seed project. So the purpose of the scoping of the seed project is essentially to frame the implementation, but there's a couple different things. There's a lot of different ways that framing of the implementation can be used, but there's 2 main reasons that we do this. The first one is we want to understand where the implementation starts, what value is going to be provided by it, what does the roadmap of implementation look like, not in this sense necessarily, but from an organizational perspective. We're going to start in this functional group. We're then planning, if it's successful, to expand into functional group, B and C, or we might start with this workflow, and then we're going to expand into these other 2 workflows. So we want to kind of understand, where's the implementation going to start? Where could it potentially go once success is shown? And then just as important, if not more important, what does success look like? So what are the actual objectives of the seed project? If we're going to embark on, doing one of these seed projects and onboarding a workflow, how are we going to measure success at the end of that actual project? So the framing of the implementation and kind of understanding what it looks like is, one of the main components of why we want to do a scoping session. And then once we have that framed out, the second thing that we can do with the framing of the implementation is not just understand the possibilities, but a lot of times we'll see the framing of the implementation. What we do at the end of the scoping session is we actually produce a project charter. So that charter is not a contract. It's not something that boxes us into a certain scope or anything like that. But what it's going to do is frame the implementation, right? Give us the roadmap of what it looks like within our organization. And once we have that information documented in this charter, we found in a lot of situations at a lot of organizations, it becomes a really valuable selling tool. So it's really a piece of communication. So we have organizations, you may need to communicate to upper management. You may need to communicate to executives. Maybe there are peers within your group that need to buy into the concept. If you have individuals reporting to you, you may need those individuals to buy into something like this because ultimately they could be the ones that are using the software, right? So by creating this deliverable of a project charter that frames the implementation, it helps us understand, where we're going and what value we're going to get out of the process. That project charter can oftentimes be used as a selling tool within the organization to communicate the benefits of the project. So the next step in our getting started process is the seed project itself. We get buy-in. We understand that these are the things that we're going to do. Here's what we're going to accomplish. This is the value it's going to provide. And then we actually want to execute. So this is the actual onboarding of the workflow. So we'll come in and we'll see some depictions of this process a little bit later in the presentation for how Oros uses Oros IQ. But we have a group or a team here. We come in, we try to understand as much as we can about the existing process within that scope, try to educate the end users who are participating in the seed project on the concepts of Oros, the different features and functions that can be used there. And then at the end of this particular step, the deliverable is going to be a production ready workflow. So in a lot of scenarios, depending on the size of the group or maybe the complexity of the workflow, the reason we say the deliverable is a production ready workflow is that our workflows and the use cases for Oros vary in so many different ways that the actual transition to production is very different from one use case or from one group to the next. We have some groups where we'll complete a seed project, let's say in 2 or 3 weeks. And because it's a very controlled group and maybe there's less than 10 people in it, we can roll it into production in a matter of a month or two. We have other groups, right, where you may have 150 end users that are using a process that's been managed in Excel or managed in a homegrown system or whatever it might be for a very long time. And the transition to production is going to take more time than maybe the first example that I used. So at the end of the seed project, we're going to have a production ready workflow. What that means is if we had a project and we wanted to use the workflow to manage or to facilitate that project or that process, at the end of the seed project, we would have that workflow ready to manage a new project. The next step in our process, though, is what we just talked about, and that's this transition to production. So like I said, you may have a lot of different users across a lot of different regions, and the purpose of this transition to production process, or this step in the process, is really to manage the change. You'll probably hear this a lot of different times throughout the presentations today and tomorrow as well, but managing the change in a lot of ways is more difficult than actually implementing the software from a point and click perspective. So the configurations and the way that our assessments work and the way that we configure our knowledge packets, all that stuff from a point and click configuration is pretty straightforward. But to actually manage the change and understand how people interact with different models and how they get their work done today and how that may change if we were to implement something like a knowledge-aware technique, that's really the purpose of transition to production. So we execute the seed project, we have a production-ready workflow, we see the value in it, but how do we actually get that implemented so that people are using it as a routine within their everyday business? So transitioning to production, we want to manage that change. The deliverable coming out of this step in the process is a production workflow. So where we went in the seed project, we had a production ready workflow. The production process, or transition to production, is where we manage the change, understand all the components that go into it. And then at the end of our transition to production, we actually have our production ready workflow rolled out and end users are using it on production projects or on production programs. So if we go to the next step in our process, which is the adjacent developments, the purpose of this particular step in the process is that organic growth. So we talked a little bit in the beginning of the presentation about, as we go through these different steps, whether it's the briefing or the scoping session or the execution of the seed project, transition to production, a lot of times we'll identify other areas in the business where the knowledge-aware technique may be valuable. So as organic, in order to facilitate the organic growth, we want to execute those 4 steps that we just talked about. Sometimes it's only the 3, right? Sometimes we may not need the briefing because people are already on board. They understand the concepts. But scoping out our project, executing it, and then transitioning it to production is what this adjacent development step in the process is made up of. So we start to see this organic growth. We've got this metaphor of the seed. You plant it, it expands. Our logo, if people are not familiar, is actually a dandelion. The idea being that the dandelion blooms, it dies, and then the white fuzzies go all over the field, and it plants more seeds for more dandelions to come up. So the idea here with this adjacent development is the planting of more of those seeds, executing more projects, scoping them, transitioning them to production so that we can start to show more value in the application of the knowledge-aware technique. And the deliverable for the adjacent developments, very similar to what we had coming out of the transition to production, is we have more production workflows. But the other item that comes out of the adjacent development is this increased awareness. So as we start to do these implementations, through word of mouth, or maybe people start experiencing the knowledge-aware technique, they see the value in it. As we do more and more projects, more and more people see those kinds of things. We have more engagements with the software or more engagements with the technique. And we start to increase awareness across the organization that managing knowledge in an active way and applying this knowledge-aware technique can be very valuable to your workflows or your work streams, which leads us to the next step in our process, which is demand-driven growth. So if we start talking about the purpose of demand-driven growth, it's very similar to what we just talked about with the adjacent development. We want more organic growth. The difference in demand-driven growth versus the adjacent developments is that we're no longer reliant on identifying areas where the technique can be valuable. We're no longer reliant on, going out, educating people, scoping projects, executing them, showing value. The value now is understood, and the paradigm has almost switched, where we're not going out and selling the concept, but rather people are coming to, the knowledge aware flag bearers or champions within the organization, and they're asking if they can do projects. So very similar to the actual steps within demand-driven growth are very similar to those that we've already talked about. The difference is how it gets initiated. So in adjacent developments, or when we do the briefings, we're going out, we're educating people, and it's kind of pushed from a business development or from an implementation perspective. With demand-driven growth, people are coming to us, and we have projects that are being requested without having to go through the process of education and so on and so forth. And then the last aspect of this entire presentation is that enterprise capability. So like I said, this isn't necessarily a step in our process, but it's rather the deliverable coming out of the demand-driven growth. So as you start to have, more workflows onboarded, and this knowledge-aware technique becomes just commonplace in the organization, it really starts to produce an enterprise capability where we can learn on, a continuous closed loop process. We can start to apply it to a lot of different areas in the organization. And we'll see a little bit later today in some of the presentations, and then as well tomorrow in a lot of the presentations, how people are starting to apply this knowledge-aware technique. We have various different organizations that are at different points within this actual flow. And we have some organizations that are getting close to where we would say that the knowledge-aware technique really is an enterprise capability, and it's used in all areas throughout their business. So again, our learning points, we kind of talked a little bit about the implementation roadmap. So the different steps in the process, we start with the briefing, we scope a project, we execute it, transition it to production, and that produces adjacent projects where we'll go through those same steps, maybe not the briefing, but the other ones where we would scope, execute, and transition. And then as word starts to get out, we start to hear a little bit about the value that the knowledge-aware technique can provide. And it is, as opposed to having to go out and identify projects, or sell the concept, we have individuals coming to us and starting to demand, projects, or rather that paradigm shifts until we get to the enterprise capability. We talked about some of the challenges associated with maybe educating individuals, scoping, and why we take a charter, what it can be used for, and then executing a project, transitioning it to production, managing the change. Those are all the common challenges that we have. We talked a little bit about the best practices. We have the charter that we produce. We have the seed project that we'll execute. We have the adjacent developments that we'll identify. So there's a lot of different ways that we can facilitate the implementation of this knowledge-aware technique, even though there may be challenges along the way. So I think that's all the content. I might have gotten through that a little bit quicker than anticipated. I guess, Jim, were there any questions? And again, there's the feedback QR code. If people want to provide feedback, like Jim was saying, we take the feedback very seriously. We use it on a regular basis to improve the conference. So any feedback that you can provide would be appreciated.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I think that's great. I think it's also important to point out too that, we practice what we preach here at Oros. We actually use the software to manage dozens of processes within our company, like onboarding and our software factoring, things like that. But we also use it to manage that entire getting started workflow that Josh just took you through. So, some of our more mature customers like GM and Ford may not see all pieces of that for every process they onboard with us, but we use it to track all the details with a new customer or a mature customer, because we want to learn and evolve that process as we go, and we've really seen it come a long way in a short period of time because we embrace that knowledge-aware approach. So I just thought I'd throw that in there, Josh. I hope you don't mind me saying that. No specific questions, but I did actually have one for you, Josh, that came to my mind while you're presenting. How do groups typically deal with competing efforts when implementing a new knowledge management philosophy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for anyone that was in the previous beginner breakout sessions, you heard me mention that a lot of our customers will give us a hard time because we'll get questions like this one, and our response will be, well, it depends. And I think in this scenario, it does depend. A lot of it is, like I said, managing change. We find that the most difficult thing to do when trying to embark on something like transforming the way that knowledge is captured, shared, and reused is just the change management. So being able to produce, tools or produce artifacts that will show value and put workflows on onboard workflows, that are producing value and showing the way that this can actually improve the business, is a lot of the way that we do that. So it's understanding the political landscape, understanding all the players that are involved. Where can we provide value? How can we provide value maybe in a short amount of time? Is there a long-term goal, and can we capture what that looks like and kind of put a roadmap together, whether it be through a scoping session or whether it be through other engagements. That really is the difficult part when it comes to implementing this and having competing efforts. It generally comes down to which one's going to be more valuable. It's not any different than other competing efforts in other areas. It's really just being able to show the value. Obviously, we're a little biased, but we believe that this is the most valuable way to manage your knowledge and to kind of facilitate process. But really, it's just putting together the case for how this is more valuable than maybe other competing efforts.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks, Josh. We did have a comment I thought I wanted to share with you because I don't think you can see them as they come in. James Malone from Megit said your presentations are very well organized. So James, thank you for that. We appreciate all the comments and feedback. And we did have a question come in. So Taraya Smith, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. She's from SRG. She said, what is the level of involvement that the Oros team has with the seed project and the transfer of information?
Yeah, that again, it kind of depends, but I think the question is kind of geared towards how much time commitment is maybe on the customer side or is on the seed team side as opposed to on our side. Typically, what will happen throughout the life of a seed project is the engagement starts off where we have like a weekly meeting. There may be an hour or two outside of that weekly meeting where the customer really needs to engage. But what we'll do is our team will come in, we'll set up an initial configuration. And then throughout the life of the seed project, which typically is about 15 weeks, we've done them shorter. We've had some seed projects we've completed in like 2 weeks. We've had some that run 20, 25 weeks. We generally don't recommend the longer ones just because we want to start to show value in a shorter amount of time. But as the project goes, that starts to kind of flip that time commitment. So there's about an hour, and our team is generally spending about 4 or 5 hours outside of the weekly meeting. And as we start to get that configuration in place, what we want to do is we want to put the ability to manage the process and the ability to change things in the hands of the process owners. So in a lot of IT scenarios, the IT department kind of controls the system, requirements are provided, and then they do coding to change, the configuration. With Oros, everything's point and click configurable. So we start off configuring, and then as the seed project goes and the seed team members get more familiar with the concepts, we start to train them on the ability to make these point and click configurations, not because we don't want to do it, but just because we don't want the business process owners to have to rely on us to do it. So we start off with a weekly meeting, because to answer your question directly, there's usually about 4 or 5 hours that our team is spending outside of that weekly meeting. And then through the life of the 15 weeks, it kind of flips to where, there's still a weekly meeting. We do still have some engagement, but then, there's 4 or 5 hours of work maybe that the seed team is going to partake in as we're wrapping the project up and then starting to kind of manage that process on their own.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that real quick, Josh, too, one thing is that, once a seed project is completed, it's not like we're like, good luck with it. It's all you. Like, we are with you every step of the way, even after that. So, we're always partners with you. We always want to help. We want to empower you to be able to make the changes you want with our system because it is so configurable. But we certainly don't, abandon anyone throughout the course of our relationship. So, and Tarai, again, I hope I pronounced your name right, but thank you so much for the question. We're out of time, but thank you all. I appreciate it. I posted the link for the survey again in the chat. If you wouldn't mind, again, taking a quick second to fill that out. Anything you have to say about the survey, either good or bad, we do appreciate it, and we do listen. We thank you for the time. Our next session, we're going to get back together with everybody in the general forum and the general session, and it's going to be about how Oros uses Oros IQ. Josh is going to do that one as well. It starts at 3:15, which is about 5 minutes from now. So we hope to see you all there. And again, if you have any questions that weren't answered in the session or anything for Josh, please feel reach out directly or to myself, and we'll make sure we follow up with you. Again, appreciate your attendance, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks all.